What would you do if you found someone who expected chains from you, but all you wanted to give them was freedom? Picture this. A man finds a dying woman in the desert, saves her life, and watches as she wakes up terrified, not of death, but of him. She doesn't fear what he might take from her. She fears what she's already convinced he will. This is a story about trust, about breaking the cycle of cruelty, and about the kind of courage it takes to choose kindness when the whole world expects something else. It's about what happens when one person decides that freedom isn't something you earn, it's something you deserve, simply because you're human. And it starts with a cowboy, a woman who has every reason not to trust him, and a choice that neither of them saw coming. The desert wind swept across the canyon like a living thing, restless and wild, pulling dust into spirals that danced in the feeding golden light. Daniel Hayes had been riding since morning, following trails that most men wouldn't even notice, winding paths between jagged rocks and dry brush that seemed to stretch forever. His horse moved steadily beneath him, sure-footed and calm, until suddenly it wasn't. The animal slowed without being told, its ears flicking forward, sensing something Daniel couldn't yet see. He trusted the horse's instincts more than his own sometimes, so he pulled the reins gently and narrowed his eyes against the glare of the setting sun. Down below, near the cluster of sharp stones at the base of the ridge, something caught his attention. At first, he thought it was just fabric, maybe an old blanket caught on the rocks and left behind by travelers, but then it moved, just slightly, and everything changed. Daniel didn't hesitate. He slid off his horse in one smooth motion and started down the slope, his boots crunching against loose gravel, small rocks skittering ahead of him as he descended. The closer he got, the more his chest tightened with a feeling he couldn't name. When he finally reached the stones, his breath caught hard in his throat. It was a woman, young, Apache, lying half-hidden between the rocks, like she'd crawled there and simply run out of strength. Her dark hair was tangled with dust and debris, her arms streaked with dried blood that had turned brown in the heat. Her clothes were torn in several places, and bruises covered her exposed skin in shades of purple and yellow. She looked like someone who had fought to survive and barely made it. For a long moment, Daniel just stood there, frozen, because encounters like this almost never ended well. History had taught him that much. People didn't trust easily out here, and they had good reason not to. He knelt down slowly, carefully, and reached out to check if she was breathing. The movement must have stirred her, but suddenly her eyes fluttered open, and the instant they focused on him, pure terror flooded her face. She gasped like she'd been struck and tried to push herself away, her injured body shaking with the effort, moving on instinct even though she barely had the strength to lift her head. Her voice came out broken and desperate. Barely more than a whisper. No, please. Those two words hit Daniel harder than any punch ever could. He froze completely, his hand still hovering in the air between them, and he realized something that made his stomach turn. This wasn't fear of death. This was fear of him. She wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of what he might do to her while she was still alive. She looked at his hat, his worn leather boots, the revolver hanging at his side, and her whole body tensed like she was waiting for chains to appear, for her world to get even worse than it already was. In her world, men who looked like Daniel didn't rescue Apache women. They captured them. They sold them. They owned them. That was the reality she'd lived with. The pattern she'd seen repeated over and over until it became the only truth she knew. Her hands scraped weakly against the dirt as she tried to crawl backward, even though moving clearly caused her pain, even though she had nowhere to go. Daniel could see it in her eyes, that terrible certainty that whatever came next would be worse than being left to die alone among the rocks. He quickly pulled off his hat and stepped back, lowering himself so he wasn't standing over her, so he didn't seem like a threat looming above. "You're safe," he said quietly, his voice as gentle as he could make it. But the words meant absolutely nothing to her because safety had never come from a cowboy before. Her breathing grew faster,
panic rising visibly in her eyes as she braced herself for whatever horror she believed was about to unfold. Daniel understood something profound in that moment, something that changed everything. Saving her wounds, cleaning the blood, bandaging the cuts, that would be the easy part. Any man with basic decency could do that much. But earning her trust, convincing her that he wasn't going to hurt her, that she wasn't about to become someone's property again, that was going to be the real battle, and he had no idea if he could win it. When she woke again, nothing felt right. The ceiling above her was made of rough wooden planks instead of open sky and stars. The air smelled different, like pine smoke mixed with something warm and almost comforting, something she couldn't quite identify. For just a moment, she lay perfectly still, her body stiff with confusion, her mind trying to piece together where she was and how she'd gotten there. Then memory came flooding back like cold water. The canyon, the cowboy standing over her, the certainty that her life was about to get worse. Her eyes snapped open and she pushed herself upright with a sharp gasp of pain that shot through her shoulder and arm. She looked down at herself and felt her panic spike even higher. Clean, white bandages wrapped around her arm and shoulder, professionally done, carefully tied. Her wounds had been washed clean, the dried blood gone, the cuts treated with something that smelled medicinal. Even her torn clothes had been mended, the rips sewn back together with careful stitches. She was inside his home, inside his cabin. Her breathing quickened as her mind raced through everything she'd been taught, everything she'd witnessed happen to women who fell into the hands of men like him. The stories were never good, the endings were never happy. She swung her legs off the bed despite the stabbing pain in her side, steeling herself for what she knew must come next, preparing herself to face whatever price her rescue would demand. When Daniel stepped through the doorway carrying a wooden bowl with steam rising from it, she didn't give him a chance to speak first. "I will work," she said quickly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them, her voice trembling but determined. "I clean, cook, carry water, obey." The words sounded rehearsed because they were, like something she'd memorized long ago for situations exactly like this, a script for survival that had been beaten into her understanding of how the world worked. Daniel stopped mid-step, his face showing genuine confusion, like he didn't understand what she was offering. She quickly lowered her gaze, expecting anger for speaking out of turn, for assuming she had any right to negotiate the terms of her captivity. "I will not cause trouble," she said more softly, her hands gripping the blanket so tightly her knuckles turned pale. "I know my place." The silence that followed felt impossibly long, stretching out between them like a vast, empty space. Daniel set the bowl down slowly on the small wooden table beside the bed, his movements careful and deliberate. "You don't have to work," he said simply. She frowned slightly, unsure she had understood him correctly, wondering if there was some trick in the words she wasn't catching. "I know how this goes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper now. Her hands tightened even more in the blanket as she waited for him to tell her the real price, the actual cost of her rescue that hadn't been spoken aloud yet. Instead, Daniel shook his head gently, his expression completely open, without a trace of the cruelty she was expecting. "You're not my servant," he said clearly. Her eyes lifted cautiously, searching his face with desperate intensity. "You're my guest." The word hung in the air between them like something fragile and impossible. Guest? The concept didn't fit anywhere in her understanding of how these situations worked. No chains appeared on her wrists, no rules were announced, no demands were made. There was just a bowl of warm soup sending steam into the cool air, and a man who stepped back to give her physical and emotional space, who didn't crowd her or loom over her or use his size to intimidate. She stared at him with wide eyes, searching his face for the deception she was certain must be hiding there, looking for cruelty concealed behind false kindness, waiting for the mask to slip and reveal what he really wanted from her. But she found nothing. His expression remained open and honest.
For the first time since raiders had taken her weeks ago, since fear had become the constant companion that followed her every waking moment, she felt something completely unfamiliar stir deep inside her chest. It wasn't safety, not yet, not even close to that. But it was something she hadn't felt in so long she'd almost forgotten it existed. It was the faintest, most fragile possibility that maybe, just maybe, she might not be owned again. The days that followed unfolded quietly, marked not by shouted commands or harsh demands, but by a strange and completely unfamiliar patience that she didn't know how to process. She remained cautious and watchful, studying Daniel's every movement like her life depended on understanding him, convinced that any moment his kindness would evaporate and reveal his true nature underneath. Each morning when she opened her eyes, the same thought greeted her. Today he will show who he really is. Today the pretense will end. But each evening arrived with the same confusing reality. Nothing changed. Nothing got worse. He never raised his voice, not once, not even when she accidentally knocked over a water bucket or burned the bread she had insisted on making. He never entered a room without knocking lightly against the doorframe first, always giving her a chance to prepare herself, to feel in control of when she had to face him. At night, he slept in a wooden chair by the fireplace instead of claiming the bed, giving her the privacy and safety of a locked door between them. She noticed everything because survival had trained her to notice everything. Trust did not come easily to someone who had learned the hard way that kindness was usually just manipulation wearing a friendlier face. Fear had lived inside her bones for so long it had become part of her, shaping how she saw the world and everyone in it. Even the smallest acts of kindness felt dangerous, like traps waiting to spring shut the moment she let her guard down. When she finally worked up the courage to insist on helping around the cabin, he allowed only small tasks, simple things like fetching water from the well, feeding his horse in the morning, or sweeping the wooden floors. And even then, he never treated her like a servant following orders. He treated her like someone who was choosing to stand beside him, like her help was a gift she was offering rather than a debt she was paying. That small distinction meant everything, even if she couldn't fully articulate why.
The morning arrived quietly, wrapped in soft golden light and the cool breath of desert air drifting through the open window beside her bed. She had been awake long before sunrise, sitting on the edge of the mattress in the gray pre-dawn darkness, listening to the steady rhythm of a world that no longer felt entirely hostile and threatening. Her wounds had healed, leaving only faint pink scars where the deepest cuts had been. The bruises had faded from angry purple to pale yellow and finally disappeared completely. Her strength had returned to her limbs, and her body felt like her own again. And with that physical recovery came a question she had been carefully avoiding, a decision she knew she couldn't postpone forever. What now? Where did she go from here? When she finally stepped outside into the morning light, she found Daniel already there near the small stable, methodically saddling a horse with practiced, efficient movements. The leather straps creaked softly under his capable hands as he worked. He didn't look even slightly surprised to see her standing there watching him. He simply finished tightening the saddle with one final pull and then stepped aside, moving away from the horse completely. That's when understanding settled slowly but undeniably in her chest, heavy and real. The horse was prepared for her. He wasn't asking her to stay. He wasn't placing conditions on her continued presence. He wasn't expecting anything at all in return for everything he'd done. He was letting her go. "You're free to leave," he said quietly, confirming what she'd already realized. The words landed much heavier than she'd expected, carrying a weight that pressed against her heart. She searched his face intently, desperately, waiting for the hidden condition she was certain must be coming, the unspoken demand that would finally reveal what he actually wanted, what this had all been leading toward. But nothing came. No conditions, no expectations, no strings attached to the freedom he was offering. The silence stretched between them like a living thing, full of unspoken possibilities and questions neither of them knew how to ask. "You saved me,"
she said finally, her voice unsteady and rough with emotion. "And you ask nothing in return?" Daniel gave a small shrug, so casual it seemed almost careless, though she could see in his eyes that it meant everything to him. "Freedom isn't something you owe back," he replied simply. Her throat tightened painfully as she absorbed his answer, as she tried to reconcile it with every lesson she had ever learned about how the world actually worked. Every experience had taught her that kindness always came with a price tag attached, that survival meant calculating what you could offer in exchange for mercy, that nothing was ever truly free. But here, standing in the morning sunlight, with a saddled horse waiting, and a man who refused to claim ownership of her life, there was nothing to repay, no debt hanging over her, no invisible chains binding her to this place, just a choice, clean and simple and entirely her own. She approached the horse slowly, almost reverently, placing one hand against its warm neck before pulling herself smoothly into the saddle. The familiar motion felt completely different now, not forced, not commanded, not done out of fear or obligation, voluntary, chosen. Daniel stepped back even farther, giving her all the space she could possibly need, his expression calm and accepting. He didn't try to stop her. He didn't try to convince her to stay. He didn't make arguments about why she should feel grateful or obligated. He simply respected her decision before she had even fully made it, treating her choice valid regardless of what she decided. She turned the horse toward the open land stretching beyond the cabin, toward the horizon where the desert met the sky. The path ahead looked wide and endless, leading back toward everything she had once known, toward the life that existed before raiders and terror and this strange, gentle cowboy had entered her world. She could leave right now, and he would not follow. He would not chase her down. He would not change his mind at the last second and reveal this had all been an elaborate deception.
The realization struck deep and profound, settling into her bones with a weight that changed something fundamental inside her. For the first time in her entire life, a man had held complete power over her and had chosen deliberately not to use it. He could have demanded anything. He could have claimed ownership. He could have treated her rescue as a transaction that put her forever in his debt. But he didn't. Her vision blurred as powerful emotion rose in her chest, overwhelming and impossible to contain. She urged the horse forward gently, feeling it respond beneath her, its muscles moving smoothly as they began to walk away from the cabin. But after only a few steps, something made her stop. The silence behind her felt somehow heavier than the open road stretching ahead. It pulled at her like gravity, like an invisible thread connecting her heart to something she couldn't quite name. Slowly, carefully, she turned the horse around. Not because she was owned, not because she was afraid of what would happen if she left, not because she felt obligated to repay a debt, but because, for the first time in her entire life, staying was a choice she could make freely, with no coercion and no fear. And that freedom, that simple, profound freedom to choose, meant more than any open road ever could.